Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining our event about Abdullah Öcalan and the women's one. And thank you for joining our event about Abdullah Öcalan and the women's liberation movement. I'm getting an echo, so I'm hoping that maybe if friends go on mute, this won't happen. Okay, that's better. Thank you for joining. So this is the third in a weekly webinar series organised by the Kurdish women's movement and particularly by CHENI, the Kurdish Women's Office for Peace. CHENI is a representative of the Kurdish women's movement. It's part of the structure, and its mission is to build connections with women's struggles around the world. So CHENI forms part of Women Weaving the Future, which is a network of different institutions and structures that are connected to the women's movement. It was formed primarily with the aim of building bridges with women's struggles and feminist movements and perspectives worldwide, with the aim of introducing the perspective of the Kurdish women's movement to a world women's democratic confederalism, starting from a local towards changing the world by liberating it from patriarchal violence and domination. In 2018, the network organised a conference in which 500 women from around the world came together to analyse issues like state repression, capitalism, poverty, ecocide, colonialism, and patriarchal violence. So CHENI is now organising this panel series, and as I said, this is number 3. My name is Katie, and I'm from the Kurdish Solidarity Network in the UK. I'm based in London. The topic of this event is about Abdullah Öcalan and his role in the women's movement. The imprisoned Kurdish political leader and thinker has played a historic role in the development of the women's movement. His analyses of patriarchy and its relationship to capitalism, the state, and the family have shaped the theory and practice of the Kurdish liberation struggle since the beginning. At the same time, his practice continues to be informed by his desire to be a genuine comrade to free women, with whom he wants to build a free life for all. In this webinar, Havin Güneser will discuss Öcalan's women's liberationist ideas and practice over the course of several decades. We will ask why and how does Öcalan view women's revolution as a vital need in the quest for freedom? In what ways did he encourage women's autonomous organisation? What is the Kurdish women's movement relationship to Öcalan today? So these are the questions which we discuss, and we encourage you to, as you consider your own, to write them in the chat, and there will be time for these at the end. So I will introduce Havin Güneser, who is an engineer, journalist, and women's activist. She is a spokesperson of the international initiative Freedom for Abdullah Öcalan, Peace in Kurdistan, and a translator of several of Abdullah Öcalan's books. Her forthcoming book, The Art of Freedom, A Brief History of the Kurdish Liberation Struggle, is available for pre-order from PM Press. So I will hand over to Helen.
Okay, thanks a lot to you and to Jenny and everyone else who is behind organizing these seminars, which I can see is very important and indeed timely. Let me just begin shortly talking about, what's happening in our world, especially as we go through the pandemic, and how this actually indeed accelerated what we call the structural crises of capitalist modernity. I guess before the COVID-19, although there was a lot of unrest uh, around the world, but also in countries that we call, capitalist, like the West, Europe, Canada, US, Australia, I guess in all of these places, um, there was an awareness, especially with the ecological crises, that what we were living and going through and our way of life is actually unsustainable. But I guess with this pandemic, what really we saw is that this is unsustainable, and that after years of struggles in these countries, and the two-poled nature of the world, there was, and I quote Öcalan here, that there was a partial peace in these countries. So perhaps the reason why there wasn't as much of an unrest as we saw with the ecological crises was because of this partial peace that was established as a result of the huge struggles and resistances that occurred in what we call the Western countries. But with the pandemic, what we are also seeing is the collapse of this partial peace in actual fact. So therefore, for the colonized and increasingly more so for the women, this partial peace did not exist anyway, but this became apparent for more and more sections of the society. And as a result, Öcalan was able to, even in the early 80s, was able to critique real socialism, as well as, before his abduction and after his abduction, come up with ideas for not only for critiquing capitalist modernity, but also, trying to put in place an alternative way of life, I guess. So Öcalan calls this a third world war, but more in the sense of the First World War that occurred, where the struggles would determine actually what kind of a regime or a system we would end up having in the world. So therefore, at present, what we saw with all these struggles, whether in Africa, in Latin America, in the Middle East, the Kurdish struggle, the women's struggle, the ecological awakening, what we're seeing is that the nation state, the state mechanism overall, has been exposed to such a degree that it is impossible to keep a lid on it. So I think this pandemic indeed accelerated this exposure and the struggle against it. Now, of course, the topic we have today is very much linked to this, because both Abdullah Öcalan, the Kurdish freedom movement, and the women's freedom movement spanned over almost 50 years, which is half of this century, basically. And as a result, of course, they are also at the forefront of facing the extreme violence, both physical and otherwise, that is coming out of these states, so that an alternative way of life and an alternative governance is not actually realized and implemented. And we are seeing this especially directed against women all over the world, but also in terms of the Kurdish freedom movement as well, especially the Turkish fascist regime at the moment is attacking women leaders all over the world, let me say. I mean, in 4 parts of Kurdistan, as well as we are seeing in Turkey, and also, as you know, in Europe, with the killing of the assassination of the 3 revolutionary women in Paris, one of whom was Sakine Cansız. And lately, of course, we are also seeing huge attacks, like 3 days or so ago in a village in Kobani, 3 women activists, the arrest, imprisonment of, and severe torture of women activists in Turkey, and also, of course, targeting women in South Kurdistan as well. So therefore, it is very timely, in fact, to speak of this link. And I guess, you know, this is a topic that has been it's been discussed quite a bit, I guess, within the women's freedom movement and the general freedom movement and amongst the Kurdish society. But it is a topic that is becoming increasingly familiar, I guess, in the outside of these circles too, but not all that well known. So I guess we have to really start with bits and pieces and talk a little bit about the situation of the Kurdish people themselves and the region a little bit, very, very shortly, because we need to see that none of neither Öcalan nor the Kurdish freedom movement, the PKK, or the women's freedom movement did not just come out of anywhere. There's a spatial, temporal, and elements to this, as well as historical aspects, as well as, of course, the individuals who are taking part in the development of the movement and its ideas. So, of course, I'm going to try and not to get into in depth of the history, because I believe there will be other seminars that will go both into the theory and the ideas as well, but I'd like to put a framework in there. So I guess we need to keep in mind that Kurdistan was colonized, I guess, recolonization process, we could call the recent one a third attempt. And the 17th century was indeed the beginning of perhaps the first terrible warfare over the colonization of Kurdistan, divided between the Ottomans and the Safavis. And this took the form, it meant that the colonization meant being unarmed, put under taxation, and to be pulled under their education system and ways of life. So the secondary colonization and occupation began in the 19th century in the run-up to making of the nation states. I'd really recommend you all to see the documentary Birds of Death and how British Royal Air Force bombed South Kurdistan in the 1920s and 30s to suppress the resistance, and how in the run-up to centralizing defense, education, and economy, the Kurdish way of life, culture, mentality had to be colonized and deconstructed. And its autonomy had to be ended. So the division into 4 states meant huge resistance and struggles in all 4 parts of Kurdistan. So they were now told to, do their military service, as I said, pay tax, and end all their social and political structures. So the narrative, of course, became very, very extreme in Turkey. Kurds were told they and their language did not exist, and they were just mountain Turks, or the area was not livable, and etc. It was barren when they came. So, and everything was done actually to wipe that memory of existence. And we're seeing that in practice at the moment as well, like being the destruction of the villages, the local leaders, activists being imprisoned. So there's a huge and active effort to both erase memory and put those who can help defend, organize, guide the society into prisons to disallow that and to suppress actually the people. And of course, much of these atrocities and crimes are not actually even yet unearthed and uncovered. Colonization also meant, of course, cultural colonization. And in parallel to these genocides and massacres, patriarchal structures were organized and or strengthened, and they formed a collaborationist class on top of these structures. So forced relocations, so the land of those sent away, given to this new class of feudal lords. The peasants were and are terribly exploited by this collaborationist class. They became landless, the peasants, and they became quite weakened in their social and political structures and relations to one another. And of course, the desire was to exactly destroy that. Now, of course, this took its, there was a huge blow on the woman as well. These landlords were adorned and given all different powers over the society, as well over the woman too. As the people were driven into poverty, these landlords, feudal lords, became very rich classes, and they represented the colonizers in Kurdistan. So, and they had the right over any woman. They could actually either put pressure or give money to be able to take the woman into their marriage. Now, a new model of a family and male was wished to be constructed through this new colonization process in there. And as the male plundered the economy, it approached the woman in a similar way as well. It tried to plunder the woman, her way of existence, and her relationship to the society, to the man, etc. So they, at the end, you know, they could take the daughter of the peasants. They drove into poverty with money, so creating a different kind of a relationship between the male, the woman, and the feudal collaborationist new class, the feudal lords. So they became slowly more and more the subject of a multi-dimensional process of enslavement. And this paralyzed the whole society, of course. You know, through this, they also paralyzed the male as well. The old practice, the elitist practice of many wives were then pushed down into the society as well. And in that, you know, the men was also deconstructed quite a bit in not in a position to be able to understand how this colonization process was going. And so they were put into this relationship where neither could actually work out a way out. And of course, in this, religion was also used to an extreme dimension. The concept of sin was rejuvenated as the most powerful discourse of religion over the female body. And slowly, you know, this resulted with a strong encouragement from these feudal lords, from the religious bodies. Misogyny became, you know, it resulted in misogyny. And actually all of this pushed women more and more between the four walls. So therefore, they could no longer actually, as I said, question the reality of colonialism and find a way out. So as colonialism became institutionalized in Kurdistan, femicide and the violence against women became more and more legitimized. So the fascism, as expressed in Turkey as the one nation, one language, one religion, and one flag discourse, has led the last century to turn into a living hell for women and the Kurds and all the other different peoples in Turkey and actually in the region. Therefore, for women, the Kurdish women, the struggle became inseparably and necessarily interwoven with defending the land and to eliminate colonialism. So I will not go into it, of course, but throughout these recolonization struggles and the warfares directed at the Kurds, there are many exemplary women who have been leaders in these struggles. Now, of course, this was the situation. The women were almost invisible. Before the dawn of the break of the dawn of the beginning of PKK's struggle. And there was a famous saying, actually, even woman's place was even after the cow in the house, because the cow was an amazingly important life sustenance in Kurdistan, as agriculture was and animal husbandry was the only way of continuing life or sustaining life. So this shows the situation of the woman, when we come to the completion of the secondary colonization and the Republic of Turkey coming alive. So, as I said, no one actually turns into a leader overnight. One has to really look at it in a dialectical way and see what kind of a place and time all these took place. So Öcalan was born in Urfa under these conditions that we are talking about, with a lot of the peasants or the rural people driven into poverty. He was born in a village called Amara in April 1949. The city itself, the province itself, was rife with contradiction, as well as, of course, potential for different kinds of developments too. Urfa is as diverse as one can get in terms of religion. You have Sunni Islam, Judaism, Christianity, Yazidis, as well as different tribes within the Kurds, and different ethnicities like the Armenians, like the Jews, Turks, Kurds, some Arabs and Assyrians, and etc. And since Abraham, we know that was his homeland, different communities actually coexisted there, and most of the time peacefully. So the potential is there to learn a lot from different communities and thereby to form syntheses out of this. Öcalan actually quite often talks about it and says that one of his struggles was not to betray his own childhood dreams. He would repeat this over and over, as he talked to the society, the women, the general community, the young, etc., to show how much the regimes or the systems that we really live in make something else out of the child that we are, and how we bow to it by letting go of the dreams that we may have had when we were a child. So I guess, of course, history, of course, the time, the diversity in the area, the contradictions in the area are important, but also, of course, the traits of our characteristics and how adamant we are, how resilient we are, and how in the long run we don't let go of them is also quite important. I guess this is one of the reasons for who Öcalan is and why he is who he is, I guess. So I guess his family, his father, was a good person, but pretty weak socially, unable to really resolve many problems at hand. But his mother, Uvesh, whom he talks a lot about, is an extremely strong woman. And Öcalan can already observe, and he talked about this many times, that how such women can be left isolated and weakened within the society? How can they be ousted outside of the society? So he actually observed all of this. He also observed how his own sister was married off to an elderly man in return for a sack of wheat, let's say. And he, today talks of this with a lot of contempt, and how he still has never accepted it. And he often talks about his childhood friend, who is called Elif, a young child, young woman child, and how she was also married off at a young age, and how after a certain age, the girls would not be allowed on the streets and to play with them anymore. How the society shunned them back into the house. So and he often observed how marriage life exhausted women and the men alike, whether it was a marriage of love or not. And he kind of could never accept that. And I guess, as he says, as he went to the city, he also saw similar things in a different way in the urban areas as well. I guess one of his important characteristics is that he's not afraid of contradictions, on many fronts, like in terms of religion versus socialism, in terms of being friends with somebody whose parents are the traditional enemy of his own family. He was courageous enough as a child, despite his mother's scolding and the family's repression. He continued to be friends with the son of the enemy family. So all of these kind of things, like being friends with Armenians, Turks, actually marrying himself and continuing that for 10 years with a lot of contradictions, and maybe another reason why he understood very well the profound and the deep-seated problems that occur between the male and the female, and not only understand the women, but I understand the men in his own self, how deep-seated that is. And of course, he, at the beginning, Urfa, as you may know, it's still like that, and back then it was like that too. It's pretty religious, and so was he, but at the same time, he questioned it a lot, like he wondered, because it was just a way of life there, but he also wondered why certain things were a sin and others not, and what would happen if one would break it. So all these build-up of contradictions actually play a huge role when finally he picks up a book, which is back then is a very, a book that is found everywhere, I guess. It's called The Alphabet of Socialism. After reading that, and as a result of this background to contradictions, he says, Muhammad lost and Marx won, and then, he kept on questioning, though. And I think this is one of the biggest traits of his characteristic, that of questioning. But I guess he was also not scared of getting into this contradictory situation. Like imagine just walking through and resolving things. Usually what we do is when there's a contradiction, we turn around and go away, or we really put a very harsh stance or take up a position. But instead of that, he takes the position of resolving the fears, the contradiction within himself before moving on. So he doesn't just ignore it. I guess this became a very, very important characteristic for him in becoming what we call a Reber now, or the leader doesn't really cut it. I guess a guide is much better in defining that. But, you know, when I say that, let me say that things were not perfect from the beginning. All I'm saying is that there was a potential, and a person with a characteristic or dimensions in his own personality that looked at things in a different light. So this also was pretty important. Important part, I guess. So, so let me, I don't want to go into too much into the history of the general movement, I guess, but it's also interconnected. But I want to, of course, go more now into, you know, the beginning of the founding of the movement. I guess 70s, you know, the end of 60s was also in Turkey. Everybody felt the influences and effect of the 1968 wave around the world, which was also felt in Turkey as well. The Vietnamese liberation movement was also felt there, as well as the Turkish left was also pretty strong. But, you know, I guess like everywhere, feminism was not, you know, or the gender consciousness was not there as yet, just like everywhere else. But despite that, the movement, and especially Öcalan or the early group, was very much open to women's involvement and women's, you know, women's taking part together with them as comrades in this movement. So in fact, there were many women as sympathizers, but there were also two very prominent women. And I guess the first seminar mentioned this a lot, Sakine Cansız and also Kesire Yıldırım were the two women who also took part, not only in the initial group, but also in the founding of the PKK. Now, at the time, obviously, the involvement of the women was mostly based on national liberation. But they're, you know, they themselves, the two women who were also involved in this, and the movement itself, they encouraged other women to actively take part in this. And Öcalan was especially supportive of women developing their strength, their capacity, and to actively take part and become leaders within the movement. In fact, let me read you a paragraph out of the statement of the founding of the PKK. This is back in 1978. They said, in Kurdistan, women are being exploited and women are enslaved. In order to overcome this slavery, women should join the revolution and this struggle. And there were first women meetings back in 1978 and 77. As you know, there were massive arrests after the 12th of September fascist coup. And Sakine Cansız was imprisoned in 1979, along with many other women cadres and sympathizers. They were severely tortured, but that was one part of the story. This severity of torture was met with amazing resistance and even more of a rebellion and struggle. And she became the guide or the leader of this resistance in prison. Now, just before and just after the coup, the leading cadres actually left Turkey. Öcalan was quick to foresee before the coup came that it was coming, and he left for Syria and then Lebanon and targeted to try to create areas where the preparation could actually, you know, meet the repression and the genocidal attempts of this fascist coup. And, you know, while those in prisons were resisting, Öcalan in the Middle East were creating space where the movement could take root, could develop, could educate, could regroup and go back into Kurdistan. As I said, I don't want to go into all the details because this was also obviously a very, very difficult period, especially because after the coup, most of the left movements or left parties went to Europe. And there they began to continue the struggle, and very soon, almost in no time, they got integrated and co-opted back into the system. And so Öcalan, seeing this, and he himself, I guess, went to, I think, Czechoslovakia and Bulgaria and saw these areas for himself, and others went to Europe. And the conclusion was not to take the center of the movement to Europe, but to stay close by, stay in the territory and develop the movement from there. So do not become a refugee or an immigrant organization. I guess this was also immensely important. So already women were being, martyred or assassinated as early as 1975 within the struggle, whether in the urban or the rural areas. So even, by 1984, there were already 7 or 8 women assassinated in different conflict and clashes. And and as you know, the armed struggle began in 1984, not before that. So while the early years, I guess, as you can see, were mainly an attempt to understand history of Kurdistan and the colonial structures and how they have deconstructed and paralyzed Kurdish society and their relationship to nature, to one another, and the family, and etc. From early 1980s, the actual work began in understanding the harm done to the Kurdish society. This is why the third Congress of the PKK becomes so really important, I think back in 1986. So the importance of this Congress is that this is the moment where analysis of personality, as well as the relationship between women and men within the organization, as well as within the society and the family, began to be developed in depth. There are, of course, the problems that I spoke about just before is being experienced in the approach to women. The question is, the question how to be a woman militant and a male militant, and how do we live? What is the meaning of a life is slowly being put on the agenda more and more. The first autonomous women's movement was really formed in Europe at first. And parallel to this, the women coming into the revolution grew very, very rapidly. So 1987, 88, 89, women joined from Bakur in really large numbers. In 1989, especially, women began to join in extremely large numbers from what we call the Rojava region today. And whereas in the early years it was women students, later on it became from all parts of the society, all sections of the society. And I guess, we have to look at the symbiotic relationship together with the characteristics of Öcalan that I've been trying to describe, and the way that he was actually shaped within the region that he was born into, together with its contradictions, conflicts, and potentials. So I guess, and one of the very important characteristics again was that on top of what he had experienced, he did not ignore the many numbers of women coming in and the sexism or the problems that they're experiencing, both within the society, but increasingly so with the large numbers coming within the organization itself. So the barriers and the obstacles that they faced in different areas of the movement, in the guerrilla forces in different areas. And I guess this, all of this pushed Öcalan into a even more profound analysis uh, of, of this whole thing. Why is this the case? Why does men of all classes actually join in together when it is about the colonization or the exploitation of women? So I guess this has been a point that Öcalan has been observing, has been living, experiencing, and is trying to also resolve, both theoretically and practically. So I guess in 1993, all of these developments and the problems experienced led him to his groundbreaking analysis, which was then published as a book and called Woman and Family in Kurdistan. Now, it was so groundbreaking that the response of the women were to come more into this organization because it really revealed, exposed the bare truth about what was happening in Kurdistan. So I guess another trait of Öcalan's personality was that he was very transparent, and he uncovered and discovered truth, and he shared it with everybody, no matter how difficult it was. So he didn't look through the lenses of, oh my God, if we talk about these problems in the organization, how are people going to view us? On the contrary, I guess one of the greatest things about of this movement is that it has been an amazing educational movement. So all of these analyses were not only done with the cadres or internally within the movement, but the whole of society went through these discussions and these analyses all together. So each time, a praxis was analyzed and turned into theory, this didn't just mean the movement overcame a barrier or a hurdle, but the whole society actually took a leap forward as well. So, and this also meant that, he didn't just analyze these things. He didn't just talk about these things. These things were also turned into institutions and mechanisms, So he very soon realized this is not, a personality disorder for one male or the other, but this was very institutionalized. And if you are to struggle with this, you had to personalize it to overcome it, but you had to not personalize it to think that, this is the true essence of you. But it's this patriarchal restructuring of you that you need to overcome. And for that, you needed mechanisms, so that it could be continuous and it should not be exclusionist. So the idea is not just to, for me to be free, but the idea is to make sure you can include as many elements of the society as possible in this walk to freedom. But for that to happen, you need to make sure that those who are colonized and exploited are autonomously organized, so you can force those with privilege to transform. I guess these were things that were incredible about Öcalan, how he was courageous enough and, and wanted to really build up a true friendship, comradeship with women, especially women who gave all they had. They were so radical in practice. And I will give some examples of that. And there's another tradition within the movement that each time an individual or an event takes place, this movement responds to it by taking a leap or by making that widespread and develop that, whatever that took place, and I will give examples of that as we go along. So let me give an example even right now. Maybe it's like deja vu, and it's pretty timely. In 1992, the KDP, the PUK, and together with the Turkish state, they attacked the guerrilla forces in South Kurdistan. And at the time, as I said, women were joining in huge numbers, in really large numbers. And Öcalan later gave, and the movement gave a huge self-critique, saying that, we were not prepared to actually create mechanisms that could relate to such a huge number of women, but in general, people coming into the organization. So there was a huge number of, especially women, but people in the South at the time, and they lacked the experience yet. And there was this attack by the PUK, KDP, and the Turkish state. Although they lacked the experience, there was such a huge resistance and stance against what seemed as an impossible, struggle against these forces. And they turned the course of history completely, in another direction. While some of the male commanders thought that this was not possible to do anything against this attack, because the attack was done in such a way as to either eliminate every single guerrilla or make sure they surrender. So it was that harsh of an attack. And, and Beritan, she became a symbol of this resistance with her stance and not surrendering and her struggle against these forces. So, and of course, she is also the accumulation, the collective, voice and experience of resistance of all the women before her since 1975 as well. Now, of course, Öcalan did not ignore as I said, the barriers, the problems experienced there, but also the resistance of women and the strength and the power and the capacity of the women. So Öcalan's response to this resistance was to declare an autonomous women's army. I know it sounds a little different today, but an own army which would be run by them. An own army where they could further develop their own theory, their own practice, their own way of running an organization, a movement. And more than that, a women's army within a people's army would mean a change in the traditional mentality of what an army is. And the understanding, it would also break down the understanding that struggle is actually a male thing, or a tool. It also became a very important mechanism in change the equilibrium, or if you like, the non-equilibrium, the wrong equilibrium between women and men, the injustices, the inequality between men and women. And of course, it was also important for women to see their own strength and live on it, trust that, have confidence in that, and also not leave women to the mercy of the male when in war, so that she's capable of actually defending of herself under every situation. Now, this was at the time one of the most radical action for women to come out of men's domain or its hegemony. It also led to the break of dependency, of women on men, and also this forced men to change at the same time. So all of these, this is why I'm calling a symbiotic relationship. On the one hand, both the society, the Kurdish people, the women have been brought to a standstill, a paralysis, and with all this theorizing again, theorizing again, what you're doing is you're trying to help women and men, but especially women, to come to her own capacity, senses, strength, power, and to redefine herself, and be herself, and to define what that being is. But that took a while, and almost Öcalan had to become their collective voice, the Kurdish society, the Kurdish woman, and he was able to overcome himself as a personality, as a person, more and more, to be able to become a collective voice of the men and women who were giving everything to this freedom movement. I guess the first Women's Congress was then in 1995, and all along, of course, this what I call this huge movement of education is continuing, and this analysis of the praxis, what is happening in the world, is continuing, and this is shared, of course, with the people. So the very first Women's Congress was in 1995 and took place in the mountains, and 400 women guerrillas participated in this Congress. And Öcalan, as a result, seeing the effects of what is happening and how this is strengthening women, began to talk about, analyze, discuss, and women began to talk within themselves about, a physical rupture even from the male. So not only mentally, but also physically. So what did this mean? This meant that, the Women's Army would take base on their own, not inside the common guerrilla units, but would physically place themselves elsewhere to completely, be on their own, on their own self and depend on their own selves. I guess there was a huge. I guess this is where we say that this wasn't just a very classical national liberation movement, because the drive actually didn't become, okay, look, let's forget about all these social and, philosophical or other developments or the development of the society. Let's just aim for one thing. Let's go for this. But what happened was seeing the extent of the damage, seeing the extent of destruction. The actual revolution actually became the walk to freedom, to re-establish the enchantment of life. Like even struggling or being a revolutionary, that you had to be enchanted, that you yourself had to be actually free. And he also noticed, because this also was within the Kurdish community as well, within the Kurdish society, and there was even a saying, a very famous saying, if two Kurds come together, they will either kill each other or there will be a huge disagreement. This was also said about women. If two women come together, they will also either fight or start gossiping or whatever. So the rulers, the colonizers, made sure that those oppressed would not actually team up. So they created conflict and contradiction amongst them. So they would actually never come together, talk about it, and organize and become an united organized force against the colonizers and the rulers. So in that sense, it wasn't just about being, very open to and not ignoring what is woman going through, what she's struggling, but also what the relationship between women themselves are, how much they can get together, how much they can agree, so he would really, and of course there were women and men who didn't really accept any of this. They didn't see a problem in this, they saw this very extreme and etc. And he would make a point and say, okay, look, whatever you experience amongst yourselves, it should never be revealed to the men, because men also use divide, rule, and conquer, So this is why, all these bits and pieces of analysis actually led Öcalan to later, when we come to the new paradigm, to go and say that male dominance or state is the most institutionalized form of male dominance. So therefore, there was an internal struggle between women, there was a struggle within the movement, there was also a struggle within the society. So all of these things, this is why I say we should not be very dogmatic, but very dialectical to say that, of course, they didn't know this from the beginning, but that, as they entered into struggle and into conflict and contradictions, that one by one, and this is where the leadership of Öcalan and his theorizing and his ideological and philosophical strategical elements come into play, is very, very important. So, and of course, women made mistakes and men would jump on this very quickly, but, it would be Öcalan then to use this, his position of respect that everybody had and his leadership position to open space and develop analysis with women amongst themselves within the organization, to further then develop both the theory and the the mechanisms and the praxis of both the women themselves and the whole organization. And of course, you know, women also had various, as I said, problems over the years. They tried to imitate the male. There wasn't enough self-confidence, you know, so there were different approaches and mistakes along the way. But I guess, again, this is one of the other important approaches of Öcalan and the movement to open space for the ability to make mistakes and make experience out of that. Öcalan, you know, was very, very radical, showed a very radical comradeship to women. He came to the point come 1998 and told the women, like within the organization too, you need to lay down your own laws against the men, and we will hold them accountable to these laws, you know. And of course, we know starting with 98 and finally in 1999, Öcalan was abducted as a result of a NATO operation together with Israel, and he was abducted and taken to Turkey, and he's been imprisoned on an island prison ever since. Now, I know I've gone on for a long, long time. It's been like 50 minutes right now, but I'm about to finalize it by saying that we need to look at, you know, after this dialogue, this relationship, this symbiotic relationship, what the woman did afterwards. And we are seeing that, of course, Öcalan has continued to deepen his philosophy on women's freedom to the point that the new paradigm was based on a society that is democratic, ecological, and based on women's freedom. So although it's been 21 years that that there has been seldom contact, the women, the Kurdish, the women's freedom have been developing this continuously in both depth and width, you know, spreading it on 4 parts of Kurdistan, in Europe, around the world, establishing different mechanisms, institutions, organizations, to be able to uncover, discover, and not only critique, but to be able to build this free life that we've been talking about. So the women then organized the women's freedom movement as a party, you know, beginning in the late 98 and then officially and in year 2000. And then later it would be the KCK, the KJK, the Women's Democratic Confederalism, in 2005. So, and the problem of freedom of men was put on the agenda and their transformation. Therefore, their education was actually taken up in those years. So the need to uncover women's history, colonization process, which was in fact termed as genealogy in 2010 by Öcalan in Sociology of Freedom, by the way, is out now and will be in England, in Britain from Monday onwards, so please get that, and have been developing that, especially in the Middle East, but interweaving that universally between different women's movements around the world. And obviously, of course, can we ever imagine the Rojava revolution, which we call the women's revolution, without this background of women's resistance and struggle and really a long marathon to freedom? So I think I've said a lot, I've done a lot, I have more to say, but I think this is pretty enough, and I hope that this will be a brief introduction to this world of transformation that has gone on for the past 40 odd years. Yeah, I think I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you, Havin. That was great. Thank you. So you covered a lot, and I think for me, what stood out was the emphasis on women developing their own autonomous ways of organizing, and the importance of not just having these ideas, the ideology that Öcalan developed alongside many of the women in the movement, but developing practices for implementing them in the structures of the movement and in society, and how important that practice is. We have had a few questions come in on the chat and also from YouTube, so I will start to read out some of those. The first is from Margaret Owen, who's the patron of Peace in Kurdistan, as you know. And it's a question about the international community. So she mentions that we try unsuccessfully in many cases to convert different parts of the international community, women in the UN, our own governments, people involved in diplomacy, to adopt this model, these ideas of peace, democracy, equality, ecology, eliminating violence against women. And yes, we find that these attempts are unsuccessful. And why do you think that might be? Is it because of the anti-state and anti-capital principles that underlie it? Is it something else? Maybe you could.
Yes, sure. I mean, thanks, Margaret, and I hope you're well. Now, of course, the United Nations is an organization that came out of the two world wars. But it's also an organization that may be best described as Öcalan puts it, United Nation States. So in fact, as you pointed out as well, these kind of organizations and mechanisms are not outside of the capitalist modernity. They run on the idea of statehood. And as we've been trying to explain, state itself is the institutional tool of the patriarchy, But of course, this does not mean that there are no good intentioned people in there, working in there, and we should not reach out to them, because as I said at the beginning of this panel, what everybody is increasingly finding out, that this system that we call capitalist modernity is no longer sustainable by anyone's standards, except the 1%, maybe, This is why what we're seeing in the huge demonstrations that are going on in the Western world, a lot of the privileged people as well, Although I'm not saying that all barriers are broken yet, or understanding how this privilege is reflected into our ways of life, but this is really, really important. So I think it's not about not understanding, but it is about understanding this would necessarily mean to adopt another way of life, So therefore, this is a very intentional mechanism, to keep everyone repressed and suppressed. Therefore, conversion is not possible. Transformation is.
So that leads me to the follow-up to this question, which is what we can do as an international sisterhood to assist with this transformation. Global transformation, I suppose.
I think, you know, we are on our way to there. I think that especially in the early 2000s, you know, there was a huge attempt by hegemonical powers around the world to make sure that there were no organizations left, that people were not organized, you know. Even they, you know, in the when you look at the Kurdish movement, for example, they tried to criminalize the PKK. They tried to, not only the PKK, they tried to tell every movement that, you know, the time of the leaders is past, you know, the time of being organized is past, you know, socialism collapsed, this is it, there's no other hope, this is the end of the world, embrace it, maybe we'll go and find life elsewhere. So, you know, stop struggling, stop resisting, and accept this, you know. And so there was a lot of propaganda to this end. And, you know, like even the latest attempts, like in Colombia, for example, you know, the dismantling or the attempt to dismantle the movement there and to appropriate it back into the system. This was also tried in Turkey, you know, but they were a little less, you know, diplomatic about it, I guess, you know, without really making any agreements. They wanted the PKK to completely abandon arms, which would leave the people actually completely exposed to what we are experiencing at the moment, you know. So in fact, we saw that they were preparing the society to complete individualism and the inability to come together and to have an organized resistance, you know. But of course, you know, all these resistances, let's not forget, I guess one of the admirable analysis that Öcalan makes, and I love it, he says, despite the contrary, I think that capitalism represents the age of hope, you know, because from many sides and aspects, you know, we have also, with our struggles, shown and produced the knowledge to expose that this king is naked, you know, that it's the elephant in the room, you know, and, you know, like the Black movement in the US, and as I said, the white young people in the US at the moment at the same time. So everybody from different directions, you know, Kurds from here, the Palestinians, the Latin Americans, in Africa, Asia, you know, everybody from different, and ecology, finally, you know, from everybody from different dimensions actually produced and knowledge, you know, it was a collective production. And so I don't think we should be unhappy with what's happening today. Of course, the only thing is to become more organized, because they are using such extreme violence at the moment, making use of those mechanisms in place of the state, you know, and the laws. You know, they are using the justice system for their own benefits, more apparent than at any other time. This pandemic showed us that the society is disposable, you know, completely disposable. So therefore, it's really no time to be left under the impression of this violence. And I guess people, despite the violence, are finding ways of communicating, of furthering this both theory and finding ways to reach, because in fact, what we have shown is that all these struggles are one and the same, you know. But I ask everybody, if in Kobani there was not such a resistance, and ISIS achieved the target it had pronounced, what would be the political landscape in Europe and across the world? You know, how far accelerated would we have, you know, completely gone to the conditions of fascism? Which brings me back to the partial peace situation that I was mentioning at the beginning. That this partial peace in Europe, in the US and everywhere else is now being broken. And there's a lot more repression and oppression against the society because they believe there's nothing to stop that. So I guess being on the street is so important. We saw that power, that we could stop things if we are out there showing our discontent, you know. Also, education, setting up mechanisms, you know, that be more long-term, I guess, are even more important because let's not forget what we're saying, what Öcalan is saying, is in fact, this is no ordinary time. This is the collapse of civilization. Either we take the moment or they are taking the moment. You know. Mm-hmm. So I guess a lot of people are seeing this and discussing, and we need to create thus more awareness and new ways of organizing this, I guess.
Thank you. So apologies there was a bit of a connection problem, but I think we all are getting used to this happening. But there's a question from Sydney Luckett. So while the women's liberation was developing within the PKK and in the broader progressive movement in Turkey or Turkish and Syrian parts of Kurdistan, what was happening in Iraqi Kurdistan?
Yeah, I guess, you know, it was the connection between different parts were so severed, actually. So it took time and lots of effort to re-establish those connections. And there was also, you know, these collaborationist or traditional movements that took over the society and would not allow much of independent or up and coming movements coming in and taking an effect, you know, because let me remind everybody that when the very first clashes or, you know, armed clashes that the PKK had was not actually with the Turkish state, but these feudal lords in Kurdistan. You know, they were the first hurdle, the first barrier. They would not allow this movement to enter the society and to talk to the society and to help, you know, strengthen the society or to organize the society. So I guess it became easier to be organized in Rojava areas back then in the early days, because after Bakur they went physically, you know, to both Rojava and Syria and later to Lebanon. And so it was like when, as they expanded, you know, they opened up to other parts of Kurdistan. And they had to be even careful at that, you know, because all these four states were very quick to exchange info and suffocate a movement before it can be born, you know. So it was like testing grounds and then slowly moving and growing and etc. So, you know, like with the Rojava, what for example he did was to take Rojava cadres from Rojava, send them to Bakur, you know, and from Bakur to send to the society in Rojava to build up that trust that, confidence, that love for one another, etc. And this also developed as they began the armed struggle, and they began to, take base in parts of South Kurdistan. So this meant contact with the people. Also, as I said, this was also very difficult because it was traditionally organized by KDP and the PUK, and it was very, very difficult to penetrate or get into, because it was, especially the KDP, due to its very feudal structure, was very much aware that this was a no-no even for itself. It meant the end of itself if they were to get in there. So slowly that also developed. And I think the very last to develop was, of course, Roshilat, which is the Iranian part, which was even more difficult to access in that sense, because of the harsh repression and the traditional movements not really allowing for that either. And so there was a huge amount of women joining the freedom movement, especially towards the end of 90s, but especially after the abduction of Öcalan in 1999 and afterwards. Actually, one could say that Öcalan became the leader of the 4 parts of Kurdistan after the abduction, not before. So it really had an opposite effect to what they had envisaged. They thought that perhaps with his abduction that nobody would care, and they could finish the Kurdish question there and then. But it was a huge embracement of all 4 parts of Kurdistan of Öcalan. Yeah.
Thanks, Havin. So there are a couple more questions, and I think, we'll try and finish shortly after 7:30. So someone from YouTube was asking, I'd love to know the position about trans identities. They're saying, I've heard that transgender people don't recognize themselves in the binary point of view of men and women in this way. So maybe you could speak about the understandings around that.
Okay. Yeah, as I said, I think, like of course, the departure points are different, I think what is being experienced in the West, and what was experienced where we are coming from, were so totally different. We organized a conference, maybe you've heard about them, as Network for an Alternative Quest in Hamburg, challenging capitalist modernity. And, David Harvey came and all he talked about was banks, and we thought, yeah, okay, this is really important, but, we don't really have any banks and a banking system, So I guess, from the point of what I've been talking about, that life was just so harsh, even those binaries were like silhouettes, like even the women and men were like silhouettes, their relationship to one another's society, as I said, to nature, were really just so repressed and oppressed that we are not talking about in the same framework as you are over here, But I guess, with the development of all these discussions, as I talked about genealogy, the sociology of freedom, I really, really recommend everyone to really read it, because I guess this is like evident in a lot of the, like non-modernist societies, non-modern societies, that this positivist way of thinking is the binary, that the way to just say, there's women and men, like Öcalan is talking about, is saying, like women should really define themselves, or, I mean, does it have to be called woman? I don't know, but like, how do we define ourselves? Do we define ourselves with our sexual organs? And this, I think, even this as a sentence, opens the way for such potentiality, But I think I sometimes don't like this imposure as well. Like, talk about things the way we frame them, And I think instead of that, I think everybody, like, we really need to understand the development of things from how those people have experienced it, not from where you are and how you are looking at it, That way, we will not impose uniformity on one another, So of course, there is, I mean, patriarchal society, this is the essence of the patriarchal society, that there should be no diversity, There is just black and white, This is in terms of the sexes, this is in terms of ethnicities, this is in terms of religions, this is in terms of our souls even, our feelings. So I think, therefore, what is important to be able to, explore it from different set of tools of mind, of mindset. So I think the genealogy committee is really trying to do this. The whole freedom movement is trying to do this. But of course, there is that way of dogmatic looking has been forced upon us too, So patriarchy is not just capitalism. It's feudalism, like Sumerians, like 5,000 years of hierarchy was all over the women and men in the Middle East. So there's a lot of things to dig, and to expose and redefine, I mean, we are not looking at going back to Neolithic, but what we're trying to do is understand those 5,000 years of layers. As we understand this with the knowledge we have today, which is becoming, I think this is why it's a very important historical time, intergenerational at the moment, then we are able to redefine what we want to be, and why put a lid on it, and I think what's really important is to create those mechanisms that within them people can struggle, self-defend, and think, do, redo, critique, re-critique, This is the only way. I mean, if Öcalan and the early group said they knew it all, well, I'm sure they would not be at this point. They would just be like the very old school, left-wing movement or a national liberationist movement. Yeah.
Absolutely. No, that makes a lot of sense. And you talked a lot about the dialectic and yeah, not being afraid of contradiction and always questioning. And I think that, so I have one more question, and then I promise everyone that we'll finish.
Okay.
So this is from Hendron, and they're asking, what about sexism as part of colonial and capitalistic dominance? So how has sexism objectified women, and what has the consequence of this ideology like been in terms of the difficulty that both men and women face in overcoming kind of their institutionalized mentality, this objectification of women.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I tried to talk about that a little bit, but I guess it's a huge area of discussion, which, unfortunately, of course, all these documents are not translated yet. So maybe people really can't go back and have a look, what was the discussion, because all these are published material, discussion in different various congresses of the general movement, and also even the discussion within the congresses of the women's movement, or the analysis that were done inside the school where Öcalan had dialogues with the cadres that came in after their time in the field, let's say, or in the revolution. So I guess especially with the early on coming, like people kind of men saw women to do the traditional roles, like the cooking, like the health area, these kind of things, and kind of were protective. Oh no, nothing should happen to them. Oh, they can't walk, they can't do this, and whatever. So this could be, whether it is intentioned well or not, it's not a well intention at the end, because this does not allow for women to break away from the cage that she's been taken into, so that she can't fly anymore. You see, it was difficult, of course, for women to walk, to do this and that, and to have confidence in themselves that they could actually do it, although they did actually do it, so like there was this very, very contradictory, much critiqued commander. When the women came in huge numbers, without discussing it with the whole movement, he actually sent them all to the cities to do work there, because he thought they couldn't do in the mountains, for example. And many of those women were without networks, they were arrested, they were imprisoned, etc. Some of them found their way back to the mountains, for example. So this is why I call it a symbiotic relationship, like despite this some patriarchal tendencies, but there was the other practices of this movement, which was revolutionary and calling onto women. So it's in itself very contradictory. Like the development comes from this contradiction. To think that men, to think that any one of us, not just men either, any single person who comes from under this being shaped under this patriarchal regime, with all the layers, and to say overnight that they have completely become revolutionary, no more male dominance, and no more women's like timidness or being not so self-confident and etc., is of course wrong to say, and it's not dialectic either. But I think there was, of course, sexism in that sense, and I said that. And even like when women began to have autonomous movement, most of the men were like, oh, right, what are they going to do now? Kind of a thing. So, but there was a constant education. There was a constant doing by women, by men, and critique and discussion. So all of this, it brings you to a point, accumulation, where you take a leap. Of course, there are those who don't like it, so maybe they fall out, because maybe they can't get over their patriarchal tendencies, and they believe that this is not how women should be, or women like that, or women who think that this is the wrong way, So there's a huge struggle, internal struggle, which is the dynamo, I think, the motor of this dialectical, marathon to freedom.
Thank you, Havin.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was amazing. And you said so much in your talk and in response to the questions. And also, you mentioned as well that there's the sociology of freedom, I think, that is about to be published. So I would really encourage.
It is published. It's on Monday, I understand. It's going to be in the UK. It's by PM Press and International Initiative Edition.
Fantastic. And you also have a book coming yourself. So we can encourage friends to look at this as well. I have one more announcement, actually, which is that, as I mentioned at the beginning, this is the third of a series of seminars. So next week at the same time, we have Nilüfer Koç, who is coming to speak about the women's liberation ideology towards free women's organizations. So Nilüfer is a spokesperson of the International Commission of the Kurdistan National Congress. And yes, please join us for this. I should also say, Havin, that there have been many, 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 many thank yous in the chat. So as well as throw lots of questions at you, I would also, just share that people are very grateful for everything, and are looking forward to reading the book. And yes, thank you very much for your time.
And thank you all. And I think, all of this is everybody's, every little bit around the world, but especially, of course, the Kurdish women themselves, every bit of effort, pain, sorrow, but hope, imagination, and their desire to lead a meaningful and enchanted life. It's the result of all that. And there are many women who gave their lives for this. So thank you for your own efforts as well.
Thank you.